God, don't take that shot." The shout tore through the headset as the SEAL commander realized what was about to happen. The distance was over 2,200 yards beyond the limits of physics, beyond any record ever set. The entire SEAL team held their breath, each of them convinced, if the trigger was pulled, they would all die together. And yet, that young soldier, the one everyone had dismissed, the one no one believed in, placed the fate of them all into her own hands. And in just 12 seconds, their world would never be the same again. Stay with us, because if you leave now, you'll regret missing what comes next. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, 27 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army. On paper, she was nothing more than another name buried among thousands of files. An ordinary soldier, trained as a sniper, deployed a few times in the Middle East, with no particularly outstanding achievements. When she stood in formation, Sarah looked just like everyone else, shoulders square, eyes forward, every step in perfect cadence. But there was one thing that set her apart: absolute silence. Silence so heavy, it made people uncomfortable. Within the SEAL team that day, her presence felt like an extra chair squeezed into an already crowded table. Hardened faces frowned the moment they saw her. A few shook their heads. Whispers carried just loud enough for her to hear, though no one dared to say it outright. "Army, huh? Out here we only need SEALs. This is a black operation. Bringing in an outsider just raises the risk." Sarah stood still, eyes locked ahead, hands clasped behind her back, betraying no reaction. This was not the first time she had felt that gaze. People had a very particular way of telling her she didn't belong here. No shouting needed, just a furrowed brow, a crooked smirk. And of course, the fact that she was a woman among battle-hardened men did not make things any easier. In their eyes, she was a name shoved in from the top, a burden, an inconvenience. But to Sarah, all those looks were nothing more than background noise, a melody she had heard her entire military career. People doubted, people measured, people sneered. And she had learned never to answer back, because sometimes silence was the sharpest reply of all. The transport plane carried them to a forward operating base near the Appalachian Range. In the cramped fuselage, while others talked tactics, weapons, angles of approach, Sarah quietly polished her Barrett M82. Some SEALs glanced over and chuckled. "Big gun, little girl." Half joke, half jab. Sarah didn't look up, but in that fleeting instant, her eyes flickered with a strange light, as if every mocking word only honed the blade she carried inside. At the base, Sarah never stood apart. She joined every drill, every run, every crawl, every climb, and did them flawlessly. And yet, even when she excelled, what she received in return was not recognition, but a cold silence, the kind of silence that was not acknowledgement, but denial. The kind of silence that said, "This is as far as you'll go. When it gets real, you won't hold up." The irony was sharp. Inside a special operations unit where skill, precision, and discipline were supposed to be everything, people often forgot that talent doesn't always come wrapped in the shape they expect. Sarah was that living contradiction, undeniable, yet smothered under a thick fog of doubt. One evening, after gear checks were complete, Sarah sat alone on the edge of camp, gazing out at the black ridgelines in the distance. A SEAL walked past and tossed out a half-joke, half-sneer, "Hope you don't get shaky hands when it starts." Sarah smiled, offering no reply. There was something in that smile that wasn't quite mockery, wasn't quite anger. It felt more like a secret she kept to herself, a secret that made the smile far more unsettling than the insult that triggered it. The SEALs, as tough as they were still men accustomed to fighting within the boundaries of what they believed possible. They were familiar with limits. Sarah was not. She had never once seen limits as a red line. To her, limits were just an equation waiting to be solved. But at that time, no one in camp knew, no one understood, and most of all, no one believed. They saw her as an unnecessary shadow on the mission, A name forced into the roster. An extra presence they didn't need. What they didn't know was that, only a few hours later, this very woman they dismissed would change the entire outcome of the mission and perhaps the course of the war itself with 3 bullets, 3 pulls of the trigger, and 3 silences that roared louder than any gunfire. Dear audience, grab a glass of water, take a moment to relax, and keep listening to the story. The twists are still to come. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a joy to see who's joining us from around the world. Drop a 1 in the comments if you find this story gripping, so we can keep bringing you more captivating tales. But no one knew that behind that silence lay a rare brilliance, a mind shaped not by childhood games but by numbers and the graceful arcs of ballistic curves. Sarah grew up in Houston, Texas, in a modest home where the scratch of a pencil sketching bullet trajectories on scrap paper was heard more often than the sound of cartoons blaring from the television. Her father, Dr. Harold Whitmore, was a renowned ballistics engineer who once advised Lockheed Martin on cutting-edge weapons projects. Her mother, Professor Ellen Whitmore, taught applied physics at Rice University, known among her students as the Witch of Formulas. For many, growing up in such a household would have been a burden, but for Sarah, it was play. While neighborhood kids busied themselves with dolls or basketball, she sat in the garage with her father, drawing parabolas with a pencil and firing questions rapid fire. If the wind shifts this way, where does the bullet go? What happens if the air is thinner? And while her classmates struggled to memorize multiplication tables, Sarah was already engrossed in advanced physics equations scrawled on her mother's whiteboard. Ironically, her parents never intended for her to follow a military path. Harold wanted his daughter to become a scientist. Ellen dreamed of her becoming a professor. But Sarah, with that unmistakable Texas stubbornness, chose the Army the moment she turned 18. Not for her parents, not for her family, not for glory or medals. She believed that if she brought that knowledge into combat, she could change the game itself. In her early years of service, Sarah was often seen as the bookworm with a rifle. Teammates would shake their heads, chuckling as they watched her scribble win calculations with numbers instead of relying on gut instinct. But when her rounds consistently struck exactly where they needed to, the laughter faded into silence. Once a soldier joked, "Maybe you should be working at NASA instead of wasting your time here." Sarah only shrugged. "Maybe. But at NASA, I'd never get to shoot." The remark made the group burst out laughing. It was one of the rare moments when she allowed a glimpse of wit to show, just enough to force even the skeptics to admit, this girl didn't just have the brain of a physicist, she carried the heart of a warrior. And then came the secret missions operations without names, without reports, without recognition. In those shadows she became Phantom, a name that never existed on any document, but whispered like gospel among special operators. They told of a night in Kandahar, Afghanistan, when Phantom eliminated 17 high-value targets in a single shift, and no one ever discovered where she was firing from. The official reports recorded only a series of unexplained attacks, but in the barracks, Marines whispered, "That was Phantom. She's still out there." It was in those long nights of lying prone in ambush that Sarah learned her greatest lesson. Recognition never came from reports. It came from the look in a comrade's eyes when they realized they survived because someone had kept the sky above them free of enemies. And sometimes, recognition came from silence itself, the silence of disbelief that a woman could possibly have accomplished such things. The name Phantom was not a title she chose. It was born from how her teammates described her appearances and disappearances, swift, unseen, as though she had never been there at all. A ghost, a living legend, drifting through the haze of war. The irony was sharp. All of those feats never existed in the official record. Sarah was still, on paper, nothing more than a standard-issue Army sniper. No medals, no commendations, no headlines. And yet, one truth no one could deny. In the world of special operations, Whenever the hushed stories began, the name Phantom was always spoken with a mix of reverence and curiosity. And now, as Sarah stood among a team of doubtful SEALs, not one of them knew they were standing beside the very woman those whispered stories called a legend. That day's mission, in the Appalachians, a secret training ground near the West Virginia border, sounded almost boring at first. Observe, take notes, and pull out. That was all the SEAL team received in their briefing. No gunfire, no Hollywood theatrics, just long, frozen hours lying still in the cold wind, eyes glued to high-powered optics, waiting. And yet, as every veteran knows, it is often the seemingly uneventful missions that conceal the turning points capable of shifting the course of a war. Intelligence had identified a reinforced concrete building deep inside enemy territory where 3 senior generals were meeting in secret. To most of the world, they were just faceless names. But on the Pentagon's strategic maps, they were the linchpins holding the enemy resistance together. Sarah lay low behind a jagged rock outcrop, her eye pressed firmly to the scope. Through the glass, she saw them clearly, 3 men in dark uniforms, bent over a map table, pointing at lines and markings on paper. Outside, guards patrolled in steady rotations, rifles slung, eyes sharp with suspicion. Everything about the scene radiated an aura of being impenetrable. In Sarah's mind, nothing was surprising. Enemy leaders, guards, heavy security, this was the kind of setup she had seen hundreds of times before. But the number glowing back from the rangefinder would have chilled any heart but hers. 2,240 yards, over 2 kilometers. Far beyond the effective reach of any sniper rifle in the U.S. arsenal. At that distance, bullets dropped hundreds of inches, and the wind shifted so erratically that even a fleeting gust could throw a round off by several feet. The Appalachian weather that day was unpredictable, swinging with each blast of icy air sweeping across the ridges. In short, this was the kind of shot even the most seasoned marksman would never attempt. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Torres, the SEAL commander, a man who had survived 3 tours in Iraq, looked through his binoculars and shook his head. He didn't need to say much. One sigh was enough for the whole team to understand. Impossible. Sarah remained still, her blue eyes clear as glass, but inside she was calculating like a living computer. She didn't see an out-of-range target. She only saw an equation waiting to be solved. Torres muttered aloud, "Not even my best shooter would try. This distance isn't meant for human hands." By all logic, that should have been the end of it. They were supposed to resume their surveillance, sketch the guard rotations, map the defenses, and quietly withdraw. But after a long pause, Sarah's calm, steady voice cut the silence. "I can take all 3. She didn't need to look around to know what would follow. The scoffs, the smirks, the heavy weight of disbelief. And sure enough, the atmosphere shifted instantly. One SEAL smirked, shaking his head. "That line sounds like the opening to a Michael Bay movie." The group chuckled quietly, just enough to bleed off tension, but also enough to underline their shared belief. Sarah was delusional. But what unsettled them more than her words was her eyes. No trembling, no sarcasm, no apology. Only certainty, cold, calm, and steady. A certainty that made even battle-hardened men falter for a moment. The way she said, "I can," didn't sound like reckless bravado. It sounded like a nurse saying, "I need gauze," or a chef saying, "This needs more salt." Simple, matter-of-fact, beyond dispute. In that instant, a heavy silence fell over the team. A few turned back to their scopes, pretending to busy themselves. Torres studied Sarah longer than he should have, trying to read whether her gaze carried madness or a truth he wasn't ready to accept. Sarah stayed where she was, eyes fixed on those 3 distant figures. She didn't need to prove anything with words. In her world, words were disposable. The only thing that proved anything was the trajectory of a bullet. And there was a bitter irony here. These SEALs, men who had survived firefights and impossible raids, now found themselves unsettled, not by enemy fire, but by the calm confidence of a sergeant they had dismissed as a liability. Somehow, her silence was more unnerving than the crack of gunfire itself. Sarah knew the moment of fate was approaching. The mission of just observe was about to become something none of them had been prepared for. Sarah opened her waterproof notebook, a small object that contained an entire secret world of her own. The thick pages, edges frayed from years of use, were filled with ballistic equations, wind charts, and tables of air density. Between the rows of numbers were scrawled notes on the Coriolis effect, something 99% of snipers never even thought about, but for Sarah, it was the deciding factor. She began whispering, not for anyone else to hear, but as a habit of self-assurance, like a musician humming a familiar tune before stepping on stage. Low-level wind, 11 miles per hour. Upper wind, 15 miles per hour. Northwest drift. Bullet drop, 340 inches. Flight time, 3.2 seconds. The entire SEAL team froze. The numbers hung in the cold air, sounding like ciphers from a foreign language. They didn't understand them all, but the calm steadiness in Sarah's voice silenced everyone. A few who had scoffed earlier now glanced at each other uneasily, as if to ask, "Is she actually serious?" One of the shooters muttered, "I don't even know how many inches a bullet drops at the range back home." The group chuckled softly, not in ridicule anymore, but to disguise the tension that had begun seeping into their breath. Sarah paid no mind. Her brain was running like a computer at full capacity, processing countless variables, the thinning of air density with altitude, temperature shifts in the upper atmosphere, the Earth's rotation pulling the bullet inches to the right. Everything wove itself into a vast symphony, and she was the only conductor able to arrange it into perfect harmony. On the ground, gusts of wind swept past the rocks, scattering grains of dust into the air. But in Sarah's mind, it was not just wind. It was an equation. It was data. Each gust a plus sign, each shift in pressure a minus. This was no longer military math. It was applied mathematics at an almost superhuman level, a fusion of precise science and instinct sharpened by thousands of hours of training. Torres, the SEAL commander, kept watching. He had seen great shooters before Marine Corps snipers, Delta operators, even CIA paramilitary marksmen. But never had he seen anyone so calm in the face of a challenge that defied every textbook. That cold, steady silence, strangely enough, began to convince him that maybe, just maybe, she could do it. Sarah bowed her head and checked her Barrett M82. She brushed away the fine dust clinging to the scope, adjusted the elevation and windage knobs with deliberate precision. Every movement was exact, ritualistic. To outsiders, it was mere technical procedure. To Sarah, it was closer to a religious rite where faith and science intertwined. A faint smile touched her lips. Perhaps the only moment she allowed herself that ease. She remembered a soldier's old joke, "You should work for NASA." Well, maybe NASA did need someone who could read the wind by instinct. But only here, on the battlefield, did she have the chance to turn mathematics into survival. The SEAL team slowly felt the air shift. No one laughed now. Their skepticism was giving way to something harder to name: curiosity, laced with anxiety, and a flicker of fragile hope. They realized they were witnessing something beyond field manuals and combat experience. In that moment, a different silence descended. Not the silence of doubt, but the silence that comes before a legend is born. Sarah inhaled deeply, lowered her heart rate, and let her body slip into the state she called the dead calm, that absolute stillness only the finest snipers ever achieve. In that state, every external factor dissolved. There was only her, the rifle, and the three distant figures framed in the glass. Sarah drew in a long breath, then released half of it. locking her chest still, her heartbeat slowing as if it were sinking with each passing gust of wind. The world around her shrank to a single line of sight, the reticle, the three silhouettes more than 2 kilometers away, and the thin space between life and death. This was the dead calm, the absolute stillness where every unnecessary tremor disappeared. Her hand rested on the trigger. No shaking, no rush. That touch was as delicate as a conductor readying for the first note of a symphony. And then, the crack of the shot split the silence of the mountains, sharp and merciless. The first round. The massive bullet tore out of the Barrett M82, flying nearly 3 seconds through thinning air, passing through the thousands of variables she had already solved in her mind. Through the scope, the first general slumped onto the map table like a puppet with its strings cut. Not a cry, not a sound. No one in the room even understood what had just happened. Sarah never checked the result. She already knew. The instant the rifle's recoil faded, she shifted her aim to the right. The second round. The man beside him turned his head in reflex, and that very movement opened the perfect gap. Sarah's finger squeezed again. The shot rang out, another 3 seconds of taut silence. Then, through the glass, the bullet tore through the second general's temple. He collapsed beside his comrade, the map between them stained red, a grim puzzle now smeared and broken. No one in the room moved anymore. Only one general remained, and he had realized the truth. The third round. The last man lurched upright and sprinted for the door. This was the real equation. A moving target, fast, more than 2 kilometers away. But Sarah had trained for this all her life. Her mind computed automatically. Speed, 4 miles per hour. Angle, 20 degrees. Bullet flight time, just over 3 seconds. She adjusted, compensating for distance, leading his run, letting instinct fuse with mathematics to solve the problem. The bullet ripped free. This time, she knew it would take longer than a heartbeat. In the scope, the figure still moved until suddenly he collapsed, crumpling at the threshold just as his hand brushed the doorframe. The round had smashed clean through his head, extinguishing any chance of survival. 3 shots, 3 kills. Total time, 12.3 seconds. The world seemed to stop. Through his binoculars, Lieutenant Colonel Torres froze, eyes wide, breath caught in his throat. A man who had survived 3 tours in Iraq, who had witnessed horrors, could only whisper, "My God, she actually did it." The other SEALs stood silent. They had doubted her, laughed even. Now, one by one, they looked at Sarah with something entirely different in their eyes. The disbelief was gone. In its place lingered something close to reverence and perhaps a touch of fear. Sarah's expression never changed. She lowered her rifle, checked the safety, and calmly jotted a few numbers into her notebook. For her, this was no miracle, no grand moment for the history books. It was simply the inevitable result of mathematics, preparation, and an unshakable belief. One SEAL drew in a sharp breath and let out a low whistle. The tension cracked, if only for a heartbeat. Someone muttered, 12 seconds, 3 generals. She just rewrote the manual. A crooked smile appeared, but this time it wasn't mockery. It was acknowledgement. Torres remained still, his eyes locked on Sarah. Inside, questions churned. Who was she, really? How could an unknown sergeant do something that defied the very limits of physics? And most of all, was this the only time or just one of many legends never told? Above the Appalachian ridges, the wind kept howling. But in the memories of those who were there, that moment would echo forever. As the SEAL team withdrew, not a single word was spoken. Yet the atmosphere had changed entirely. The wary glances from earlier, the eyes that silently said Sarah was nothing but dead weight, were gone. In their place lingered a respect they could no longer conceal. Some nodded quietly, others turned toward her slowly, as though seeing for the very first time the person behind the uniform. Torres stepped closer. He didn't ask much, just whispered enough for her to hear. "Sergeant, who are you, really?" The question carried not only astonishment, but also unease. Because when someone could accomplish what lay outside the laws of physics, their true identity became an unsettling mystery. Sarah only smiled. A thin, steady smile, the same way she had just pulled the trigger. Officially, I'm just an army sniper. Unofficially, I'm the reason the enemy loses sleep. The answer drew a few faint chuckles. Not mocking laughter, but a release of the weight pressing down on the moment. Humor brushed the edge, but beneath it lay a truth they all felt. She wasn't joking. Leaving the Appalachian Mountains, the SEALs moved swiftly and in silence. Their hearts still pounded, not from fear, but from knowing they had just witnessed something they would struggle to ever put into words. How could they explain that an unknown army sergeant had taken down 3 enemy generals at an impossible distance? Even if they spoke of it, who would believe? 3 months later, intelligence confirmed what Sarah's bullets had done. The deaths of the 3 generals had collapsed the enemy's command network. Groups once tightly linked unraveled into chaos. Organized resistance dissolved swiftly. The region grew quieter than any large-scale military operation had ever managed to achieve. And yet, in the Pentagon's official files, no shots were recorded that day. No mission listed Sarah's name. No report confirmed that SEALs had ever worked alongside an Army sergeant in the Appalachia operation. On paper, Sarah remained nothing more than a standard-issue Army sniper. Nothing more, nothing less. But in the whispered stories that passed through the military, the name Phantom began surfacing more often. Marines spoke of her in hushed tones, as if fearful of something beyond comprehension. Special operations officers mentioned her cautiously, only behind closed doors where no pen, no recorder could reach. And within the SEALs themselves, Sarah became a living legend, the woman who stepped in, then vanished, leaving behind a crack in the very definition of impossible. Torres, the man who had witnessed it firsthand, was haunted by the image of those 12.3 seconds. For him, it was like an exclamation mark slammed onto the end of his career. Years of combat, countless brushes with death, none had ever made him feel as small as the moment a quiet sergeant rewrote the limits of physics with 3 bullets. In Washington, a few high-ranking officials received reports far more detailed than the sanitized files. They remained silent. To acknowledge Sarah meant facing a torrent of questions. How had she done it? Why did such capability exist outside the standard chain of training? And if the world knew the United States had such a phantom, what would it mean on the diplomatic stage? So the simplest choice was to wipe the slate clean. No shots fired. No soldier named Sarah in any classified operation that day. Only the sterile lines of a report. 3 high-value targets eliminated. Cause, undetermined. Strategic impact, total. Sarah never cared. She sought no medals, no glowing articles, no speeches. For her, recognition came from elsewhere. From the silent nod of soldiers who once doubted. From Torres's uneasy smile as he signed a report he knew was false. And from her own calm certainty in knowing that once again she had become the shadow that haunted her enemy's sleep. The irony was that her silence made her legend all the stronger. Because the things never written down are often the ones remembered longest. Years passed, and the battlefield of Appalachia became nothing more than a faint blur in classified reports few would ever be allowed to read. The world had forgotten, but those who had been there had not. And it was that very memory that brought Torres, now retired, to Arlington, Washington, D.C., on a gentle autumn morning. He attended a veterans gathering, a place of silver hair, worn jackets adorned with old patches, and stories told for the 100th time yet never losing their weight. It was a place where men remembered not only what had happened, but also what had never been recorded. Torres, holding a flimsy paper cup of coffee, froze when his eyes caught a familiar figure. She stood before the war memorial wall, shoulders squared, posture so modest she could have blended into any crowd. But he knew instantly it was Sarah, the woman he could never forget as long as he lived. Sarah wore no medals, no uniform. She only reached into her pocket and pulled out a single steel round, corroded by years. A bullet identical to the kind that had once changed the course of a war. Now no longer a weapon, but a symbol of silence and of sacrifice. She laid it gently on the cold stone, her hand trembling not from age, but from the sheer weight of memory. Around her, there were no cameras, no journalists, no medal ceremonies, only the wind moving through the trees and old soldiers standing in reverent quiet. One veteran, his hair pure white, whispered behind her, "We remember, and we always will." The words were not loud, but they were enough to fill the silence of the morning. Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. Then she turned, walked away, and melted back into the crowd as though she had never existed. No one tried to stop her. Perhaps that very disappearance was her way of remaining in silence, in memory, in stories that would never be printed. Torres watched her go, overcome by a feeling he could hardly name. He had seen heroes honored on stages, had watched men stand before cameras to receive medals. But the sight of Sarah walking quietly away, leaving behind nothing but an old bullet, struck deeper than any ceremony ever could. In his mind, the events of that day flashed once more: 3 shots, 12.3 seconds, and the moment an entire SEAL team learned that impossible was only a word that had yet to meet the right person. He knew no official report, no line in history books would ever capture it. But he also knew that sometimes the stories that matter most don't need ink to survive. A veteran beside him chuckled softly, as if to cut through the heaviness. That woman, if she'd opened a math school, NASA would be out of work by now. Torres smiled faintly, then shook his head. No, Sarah had not been born to be a professor or a scientist. She had been born to prove that the rigid laws of the world could bend in the hands of the right person. The crowd kept talking, but in Torres's mind, everything else faded. What remained was her silhouette, vanishing into a sea of ordinary people, dissolving like a ghost. Phantom, the name her comrades had once whispered. Sarah closed her chapter not with the thunder of gunfire, but with a simple symbol, an old bullet on a wall of remembrance. That was how she left her mark, without noise, without medals, yet enduring and impossible to erase. And you, my dear audience, brace yourselves for the next twist in this jaw-dropping story. So, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're truly loving what I'm doing here. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always a thrill to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe.